Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Foundations Podcast. This is a platform built by Lay Foundations that is dedicated to platforming and elevating the stories and the sacrifices of Christian pastors and leaders around the world. We can see movements of God happening in so many places, and sometimes in this era of social media and headlines, it's refreshing to be able to hear vulnerable, real stories of what pastors are doing in their context and how they sacrifice in order to get there. On today's episode, we have Chris Bennett, who pastors at Vintage Church out of Malibu, and this is such a great conversation where we got to be vulnerable, get down to some really awesome and hard things that they've experienced planting their church and really establishing themselves as a leading voice in California within the culture there, and I just know that you are going to be blessed by this episode. I had so much fun recording this episode with Pastor Chris, and I gained so much value, and so I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode of the Foundations Podcast. I always love asking people this question of, did you always know you wanted to be a pastor? Because I feel like there's people that get prophetic words over them. There's people that pastor's kid grew up in the church, always wanted it. And then there's also people that never wanted it. And then all of a sudden they get thrown into a life as a pastor because that's how God works sometimes. So I'm curious what your journey to being a pastor was.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I met Jesus at 7 years of age, and I just remember at a young age not knowing what that would mean, but I just wanted to follow him. And as noble as that sounds, like I just had this inclination to serve him in some capacity. My granddad had been a Baptist minister, and so I grew up in and around the church. I don't want to brag, but I was in handbells in junior high, and man, my whole world was like church my whole life. And I think, kind of looking back, I'm like, I don't think I was really good at anything else. Like I loved people.
Yeah.
I love God. I love sharing his love with people. And so I just kind of found myself in ministry. I never went to seminary. I just kind of like look back and I go, oh man, God, you just kind of aligned things and arranged things. And I found myself in a ministry setting consistently. We'll get to more of that later, but there were some setbacks along the way for sure.
Have you felt like, because I got saved at 16. So I feel like when I got saved, I didn't know anything, wasn't raised in the church. And I think that sometimes when people grow up a believer, unfortunately, right? I mean, I think that the reality is a lot of people have more of a jaded view sometimes. Yeah. And so I always don't resonate with that because I got saved when I was a sophomore in high school. I'm a first generation Christian. So when it was all new to me, you know, I hear about all these stories of people growing up Christian, and I'm like, oh, I wish I had that. But then sometimes I have conversations and people are like, no, I wish I had what you had, because growing up and seeing more sometimes jades our view. So I'm curious what you were like in that way. Like, did you have a jaded view because it was so around you all the time, or did you have a different experience?
That's a good question. And I look at some of the friends that I grew up with that had very different experiences. And I would say a lot of us had the same experiences, but we had different perspectives of how we went through it. And so for me, I saw, you know, all the behind the scenes stuff of how church works. And I've seen all the gnarly stuff and church splits and all the things. But somehow what I'm grateful for, and I have wounded people, and I've been wounded by people, you know, and I've just landed on, you cannot separate Jesus from his church. And I've watched too many people that have said, I love Jesus, but I hate the church. And I'm like, well, you don't get to choose. You know, Jesus is the head of this imperfect body, and it is messy, and it is his family. It's his design. And so I've just chosen, you know, I'm going to lean in during the hard times because I believe so much in this, and that we were designed for life together in community. And so I wouldn't say jaded, but my friends that have gotten jaded, I've watched their life in God go the other way, and the just bitterness and offense, and then, you know, I've watched people build ministries around their wounding, which is, you know, never helpful. So, I think that's kind of been some of my journey.
Yeah. Does that alter the way that you see church hurt and pastor people as a result of it? Because I think it's easy sometimes to say, like, just, you know, like, hey, you're wrong, your viewpoint should be different. But then when we actually watch the people that we love do that, it's devastating.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if that's like, is that a lens or something that you look at as you're pastoring your church?
It's funny because, you know, maybe we'll get into this later. When we moved to LA from Oklahoma 7 years ago, I never thought I was going to pastor, and that's all I had ever done, but I never thought I was going to pastor a church again. And so then when God ended up leading me back into leading this church that I'm leading now in Malibu, I think my wife and I were very thoughtful about, okay, like we're not changing the messaging, but some of the approach, I think we want to do things different. And so I have a ton of empathy and compassion for people that have had negative church experiences.
Yeah.
I've had them. And like I said, I've caused them, never on purpose, but I told our church a couple weeks ago, we're doing this series on the church is, and I was doing the church as a family. And I'm going, there's about 5 people that I can name right now that would listen to me give this message and go, you are a hypocrite. Like, how could you talk about church as a family? And they have wounding as a result of my leadership. Wasn't my intention, but it's just this mixed bag where, like one of my life passages is Psalm 68, where it says, God's the father of the fatherless, defender of widows. He places the lonely in family. And so God as a father is looking for those who are isolated and don't have belonging. And I believe the church is the surrogate family of God. And so it is like his plan A for true belonging. The world's all looking for connection and belonging. I think the church is meant to be that place. Unfortunately, because of our own brokenness and our own wounding, it has the potential to be painful. And there was this, my wife and I wrote a book about family a couple years ago called Fighting for Family. And one of the things we found is that sociologists would talk about how one of the places we get wounded the most is in family. And yet the place that we get healed from that type of wounding is in the context of family and community. So it's not a matter of if we're going to have some measure of disappointment and pain. It's, well, where do we go with it? And if we isolate and disconnect, it perpetuates our pain. But if we actually lean in, and it doesn't mean we have to go back into that same community if it's toxic and unhealthy. That's not what I'm suggesting. But the only way to get healed from that pain is in the context of family.
Yeah, that's really good. I think that's so important, like, especially as leaders and as pastors, the humility. Like, I love what you said is, you said, you're preaching on what the church should be.
We're all hypocrites.
And there's some people that would listen to that message, and that's so crazy. I heard you mention you never thought that you would be pastoring in Malibu. So why is that?
Yeah, our journey was, my wife and I planted a church in Oklahoma in 2009 that we pastored for nearly a decade. And we never had a vision for anything genuinely beyond living in Oklahoma. And it's a longer story, but through a myriad of ways in 2018, some is just like vivid dreams, some really significant prophetic words that all were pointing a very clear direction. Over about a 6-month time frame, it became like genuinely undeniable, the loudest, clearest God had ever spoken to me and my family, that he was calling us to move to LA and to build family with people in one of the loneliest cities in the world. And that sounds great. And then you go, well, how do you make money doing that? What does that actually mean? And I still don't know the answer. No, but we moved out here, transitioned the church over that we had planted, and one of our pastors, and flew out to LA. I landed on August 19th, 2018 with my 2 oldest boys. We have 4 kids. My best friends in the world, Bo, who's 21, Nate, who's 20, and then Brooks, who's 17, and my daughter Joy's 14, and my wife Julie and I have been married 25 years. And so we moved, bro, literally like parachute jumped, landed in LA. I've got a picture of me and my boys at LAX. I don't know where I'm sleeping that night. I don't recommend this. My wife was back home packing up our home, and our plan was, okay, we're going to sell the house. We'll make a little bit of money off the house. That'll give us kind of a 6-month on-ramp to, we were going to work in media and kind of do some work in the entertainment space, all around building content around family with a faith leaning. And so landed in LA, met a family that week that let us, they said, hey, you can come move with us, live with us until you sell your house. Our house had gone under contract. We were going to be with them for 2 weeks. So here my family of 6 moves in with this family. Our 2 weeks with them turns into 9 weeks because the contract and the house fell through right when we got here. And the crazy thing was we ended up picking a move out date. And I remember Julie and I talking and going, okay, like we don't want, there's a proverb about don't overstay your welcome. And we're like, they've been really gracious, but we are a big family. We're a lot. And so we just picked a move out date. We said November 9th, we're going to move out. We had moved in the beginning of September. And November 1, my wife went to the doctor. She had tried to get in to the doctor in Oklahoma, couldn't get in. She'd felt something under her arm, didn't know what it was. Doctor said it's probably scar tissue. So goes to this doctor in LA. I remember she calls me on November 1 and she said, babe, I have metastatic breast cancer. And just, you have your story of what you think it's going to look like. And then we had this moment of like, okay, this changes everything. Yeah. And I remember she drove to the house. We're going to be without a home in like 7 or 8 days. And we sat in the car. I mean, we cried, and And I just said, babe, do we just go back? Like, we have a home in Oklahoma. Her
Yeah.
family's there. Our community's there. And my wife is, I mean, she really is the bravest person I know. She said, babe, God called us to LA, and he knew I had cancer in Oklahoma, but if we had found out then, we never would have come. And so he didn't let me find out till we were here. God's called us here. We're going to walk this journey out here. And so it's kind of that burn the ship kind of moment where you go, all right, Lord, like when Jesus goes, you know, we cannot live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds from the mouth of God.
Amen.
And we had to go back and say, all we have is the word of God. And do we believe that's enough?
Mm-hmm.
And so we decided to stay, moved out of this family's house a couple days later. And that led to her starting chemo the next week. We ended up moving 20 times over the next 6 months, all over LA County.
20,
bro. And trying to sell the home in Oklahoma, our stuff ends up getting put in storage, and we are on this crazy faith journey. And I've been reading like Hebrews and Romans about Abraham, you know, and Abraham went out knowing where he was going, you know, fully convinced God was able to fulfill what he promised. And he went from tent to tent with Isaac and Jacob. I'm like, this is becoming way too literal.
Yes.
And yet there was this strange joy that came in the midst of it. My wife was sick. Her hair's falling out. We're bouncing around LA. But what started happening was this call of family that brought us to LA. We started experiencing it because the whole essence of what we were trying to build was, you know, your family of origin isn't the only place you experience family. Really,
Mm-hmm.
it's the spiritual family of God. And so we start meeting people that would open up their homes or they'd know somebody. And so the way we made it those 6 months was strangers that became family to us. And so it's crazy because the studio, I could throw a rock from here to this little house that is the place that we were writing our book on family on.
Wow.
While my wife had no hair. We're going through all the stuff. And so anyway, am I answering your question? It's just been a wild journey. So to Malibu, what ends up happening was we finally get a home in Burbank. She goes into remission. We start creating media content and whatnot. And then COVID hit and her cancer came back, and it was more advanced. It was basically like almost into stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. And so here we are again going, all right, Lord, did not see this as we thought this was behind us. A million miracles I could tell you along the way. But she went through a 1.5 years of treatment, went into remission again by the grace of God. And 3 weeks, she'll be 5 years cancer-free,
Wow.
which is like a major marker
Praise God.
in cancer. And I prayed a prayer a little over about 4.5 years ago. And I said, God, everyone's leaving LA. I was watching people go to Tennessee
Seattle
and
too.
to Texas.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure. And I said, but Lord, we believe you called our family here. And I said, if you want us to stay in LA, then I'm asking you to bring something to me that keeps us here that's related to our purpose of why we came. Never thinking that meant pastoring again. And we were part of a church and going to church, and I, again, loved the church. It wasn't that. I told my wife our first 3 years in LA, I said, someday we're going to live in Malibu. Like, I don't know how that's going to happen. She's like, cool. I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, and so I prayed that prayer. 3 weeks later, I get an Instagram message from a guy I hadn't talked to in a decade. And essentially he said, hey, I'm on the board of this church called Vintage in Malibu. We're looking for a pastor. I've been following your journey. I'm like, of course you are. And then in Malibu. And so that kind of re-entered us back into the pastoral world we've been in for the last 4 years.
Wow. What a story. And, you know, scripture tells us that God's word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. And I always like to think about, you know, a lamp, an oil lamp, it's only illuminating 6 feet in front of you, right? So the more that you faithfully walk, the more that is illuminated. And how many times I wonder if God were to illuminate, because sometimes when he conceals things, it's for our benefit. Yeah. And I just wonder, when it comes to the call of God in our life, if God were to illuminate the next 20 years, I don't know how many people would be like, sign me up. I think most pastors and Christians would be like, actually, you know what? I'm good.
That's right.
Right? If he illuminates, hey, you're going to move to California. Your wife is going to get cancer. All of this is going to happen. You know, like that stuff is just so, but it's the glory of kings to search it out, right? God conceals things. It's the glory of God that conceals a matter, but it's the glory of kings to search it out. And I think that in that search, what you're sharing is like beautiful testimony. You're testifying of God's goodness. And I just think that's so cool. And I love that you keep bringing up family. And something that I think is unfortunate in a trend is family dynamics that are so hard when it comes to planting churches and pastoring churches. The church that my father-in-law founded our church, 28 years ago, and he has 3 kids, and he's an amazing dad, amazing pastor, and he brought his kids along the whole journey, and they all grew up loving the Lord. But I found that is such a rare story.
Yeah.
And so how have you found to follow that call of God on your life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're moving across the country, right? You have kids, but maintaining that core identity in value system with your family and making sure that you guys are good through it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, I think there are some core values that we've always held on to, which is like authenticity being a big one. Is like, we're not going to pretend with our kids. We're not going to put them in inappropriate positions of vulnerability. I've seen parents where they like are processing too much with their kids in the wrong stage of their life, but we've always valued authenticity and vulnerability, and that's kind of what I was saying. Is like there's each of our kids, you have to know their wiring, their age of maturity, and what's the appropriate measure of vulnerability. But what I look back now on is, one, we made the decision to move to LA, and our kids were 14 down to 7 at that time. It wasn't that it was their decision, but it was, hey, impacts everyone. And so we were really thoughtful about, we're going to seek God together. We're going to wait on the Lord together. And our prayer was, God, would you give each of our kids their own revelation that you are calling our family? And it was really sweet because every one of them in their own way, it was each of them like, we believe this is God, you know? And so they all felt like they had a voice, and then obviously we were going to make that decision. So once we, made that move, what I found was, because of how God showed up in the most miraculous ways, God became so real to them, and they already had a love for him. But I remember hearing a pastor say years ago, no, everybody wants to see a miracle, but nobody wants to be in a position to need one. And when we stepped out, moved to LA, we were constantly in positions where, God, if you don't show up, like there's no path forward, there's no way. And our first 3.5 years in LA was filled with 2 cancer battles, 20 moves with no income savings or retirement. I was working, but I wasn't generating money. My primary role was taking care of my family. And somehow in a city like LA, we never missed a payment. God abundantly supplied, and it wasn't through our family. We didn't have benefactors bailing us out. It was like daily bread type of stuff. And I remember the month after we moved to LA, right before the cancer hit, this guy, I was just on the phone with him on the drive here. He's become a close friend since, but it was an acquaintance at this point. I moved to LA. A month in, I get a text from this guy. He's like, hey, I don't know if you remember me. I tracked your number down. God woke me up at 3 a.m. to pray for your family. I know y'all just moved to LA. And he said, I feel like the Lord said that it's your faith that led you to LA, but it's your trust that's going to keep you there. And he said, because trust deals with the deepest issues of the heart, and God's going to give you incremental clarity that you learn to trust him along the way. And so it's kind of what you're saying, which is like, God gives us enough to say yes to that requires faith, and then we have to trust him the rest of the way. And so I remember once the cancer hit and we had to start moving, that word that 2 months earlier was like, oh, that's cute, put it in my phone. All of a sudden I was like, oh, this is a word from the Lord of like, I will step out in faith and stay to the degree that I trust. And trust is about the character of God. So it's like very quickly I could realize where I trust him and where I don't, because it was like, if we finances were secure, and then all of a sudden finances gets pressed and squeezed, you're going, oh, maybe I don't trust him in that place. Or your health. Okay, at least we have our health. And then you're in a vulnerable place and you go, oh, do I believe that God can heal my wife? Like all those things get confronted. So anyway, all that kind of came to the surface during this crazy time.
Yeah. I love what you're saying just about miracles, but not being in a place where you need one or are positioned in the right place. I remember when I took a season away from being on staff at our church because my podcast I started online started really growing. So me and my wife, we were just feeling like, okay, this is the time that God's calling us to step out. And I just remember that financially, right? It's like, okay, it requires a measure of trust. And I just remember, I think all of us have staple moments where there's like a miracle that happens, and it's just like his mercy and his goodness as a reminder of like, oh, miracles aren't difficult for you to do. And I think that's really important to understand. And one that I always go back to with myself is, and again, we in stories, especially when pastors and Christians tell stories, it's like, this is an outlier. I don't remember, I don't recommend this.
Don't try
but
to
I
sit
remember
home.
I was sitting there and I was just working, and we had like our mortgage was due. And I was like, you know what? I just am full of faith. Like, I know this is what God is asking me to do. And so I'm like, I'm going to fast. And I prayed this out loud, which again, like, I don't recommend praying this out loud, but I said, God, I'm not demanding anything, but I so believe that you're going to come through for me that either miraculously, like we get some type of financial resource and help with our mortgage, or I'm going to starve to death. Like I literally prayed that out loud.
The Lord's like
yeah, exactly. But it's so funny because literally 30 seconds after I prayed that, I'm on, and then an email pops up from a Christian brand that was like trying out testing this thing. And they offered me like, hey, would you like to do a brand partnership? And it was the exact amount that I needed to make mortgage.
Come on.
And I remember just sitting there, I just started crying and I was like, man, cool. and going forward, it's like, God, it is not difficult for God to do those things. Yeah. And all it takes is that faith. And I'm wondering, do you have like a specific story? I know you were talking about people came in and offered you to stay, but is there one specific thing that you can, like one of those where you're like, oh, I always go back to and I laugh about that?
No, there's two of them. And one was, so we had set that move out date for November 9, November 1. She got the cancer diagnosis. We'd made the decision to stay. We were at a gathering with a small group of leaders, like those in between days, like November 6th, 7th, 8th. And one morning, there's about 20 of these folks coming around, my wife praying for healing for her from the cancer. And this guy hands me $100 bill. And we had nothing. And I'm like, hold on, this $100 bill. This guy's like, you guys are called to LA. Like I'm sowing into you. Second guy hands me $100 bill. Third guy, $100 bill. This guy goes, you're called to this land. You guys are good soil. And I'm prophesying 100-fold return on this. So I'm holding these $300, you know? And so then 2 days later, the morning we're moving out, November 9, I wake up that morning. And the Lord impressed on my heart to read Exodus 14, the party in the Red Sea, and, just hit me in a different way. I know that story, but I was looking at, okay, they were hemmed in by God, not by the enemy. God like has them backed up, with the water behind them. They can't go backwards. Then he sends the enemy armies against them. And of course they're freaking out, grumbling, complaining. Why did you bring us out here to die? And that's when the Lord's like, Exodus 14 is like, be silent. He basically goes, I want you to look at all these Egyptians, said you're never going to see them again after today. He was basically, I want you to see what you're against. I'm about to show you what happens when I'm for you and I'm with you. And so I remember reading it going, oh, wow, Lord, you did that. And then I just felt like you said, son, I need you to trust me. You don't need to ask me for what I know that you need. And so I remember repenting going, okay, Lord, I'm going to trust you. And I get a text like you right after that. And a friend of mine in Texas, and I call him, and he goes, hey, can you get on a call? And this is a guy that I rarely talk to on the phone. And he said, hey, my wife and I are praying for you guys. I saw that Julie just got the cancer diagnosis, said we want to pay 6 months rent for you guys. Wow. Now they live in Texas, and I'm like grateful. And then I'm like, you have no idea what it costs to live.
That's 2 months for you.
Exactly. You're going to buy my coffee. And so I don't tell him about the thing, the $100 or whatever, but they end up sending us a check for $30,000, which is the 100-fold return from 2 days earlier that those guys had prayed for us. So then we're like, oh my gosh, we're going to be able to get a home. And I was like, I'm like weeping. And then we can't get a home. Like apparently you have to have this thing called a job for people to rent to you. I was like,
thanks 2008.
Yeah, exactly. So that goes to the 20 moves. But the last story I would tell, it's very related, was nobody would rent to us. And I just felt at times, you hear faith stories and they sound romanticized. It was not fun. Like, I felt like a crazy person. At times I felt like I'm missing God. Am I being a bad husband and father? Am I putting my kids in vulnerable positions? And so after like move 19 or 20, we'd finally sold our house and we had, that money was all we had, in my view. And so I got into fear mode, which is like hoard, protect, and justify it, because like we need to be good stewards of this money now that we have. And I held on to it for like a month or so. And I got up one morning on the way to church and I read in Proverbs 3, and it says, give the Lord the first of all your increase. And because I'd been like, it's not income. I'm like justifying it with the Lord.
It's like the gross versus net argument.
So dumb. It's so dumb. As if the Lord's like, good point. I'd never even thought of that. No. And so I just was like, oh man, all right, this is like fear. I repent. I said, Julie, we're going to write a check. We're going to write a tithe today. And so go to church that morning, it's a big check for us. The next day I get a call from a lady I did not know. And she said, hey, I met your friend, told me your story. I have 2 houses. One's in Beverly Hills, one's in Burbank, which is 4 miles from my kids' house. 5-bedroom house right by my kids' school. She said, I'll rent it to you for half the price. You can pick whichever house you want. And we ended up living there for 3.5 years.
Wow.
But it was out of that act of like obedience.
Yes. Oh my gosh. That is crazy.
That was a good one.
And that's, yeah, that is a true miracle story also because it is the fact that it is California.
Yeah, totally.
That is wild. I love that. And I know that you're talking about the journey from, starting at Vintage to now. And so, we're talking a lot of origin story, but what are some of your favorite things about pastoring right now with your church?
That's a great question. Again, I think because I never thought I was going to pastor. Like I thought I was going to pastor people organically, not vocationally. Mm-hmm. And I remember our first 3 years in LA where I'm like doing nothing ministry wise and people would still call me a pastor. I'm like, I'm not a pastor. It's like, stop calling me that. And so I just, coming into this role, I think what's been the most fun for me is my whole life ministry was kind of in Texas, Oklahoma, which they call the Bible Belt. And there's beauty in that, but what can come with that is kind of cultural Christianity, and you go to church because you should, and there's a lot of mixed bag religion and legalism and all that junk that's a generalization, but a lot of that comes with it. It just does. Being in a context like Malibu where I'm at, the coolest part for me has been the eclectic, diverse nature of people that come to our church and people that have known Jesus for a long time, but weekly. The thing that will bring tears to my eyes when somebody comes up to me, and it does happen on the weekly now, where somebody's like, today I came to the church for the first time in my life, or I invited my friends, they've never been to church, they've never wanted to come to church, and now they want to come back. And just to make church accessible to everyone and kind of helping people reimagine, not in a biblical way, but like what could the church be?
Yes.
And what could an experience be that introduces them to the Father of the house? And so I think that's what I'm loving now is almost, I think the Lord was gracious those first few years I had to unlearn some things, like a different language. And I think if we'd moved right into LA and started a church or something like that, I don't think we knew the culture. I don't think we knew the language. I don't think we knew the people. And so Malibu is interesting because it's a very small town, and yet we have people that drive, literally 1.5 to 2 hours every Sunday from all over to come. And so it's a church that meets in Malibu, but it's really a regional group of people. And so a ton of diversity that comes with it.
Yeah, it's definitely a different type of culture. And I, in that way, Seattle and LA or Malibu is very similar in that where people don't pretend. No. They don't pretend to be cordial about the Lord. They don't pretend, and I honestly, I've lived there my whole life, but I would prefer it that way.
Me too.
And when you look at scripture, what does Jesus say? If you love me, obey my commands. And I think that there's a lot of people in the world that don't love Jesus. They don't serve Jesus, but they like to act like they do. And I would rather you just be upfront and honest about it. But I think that I love what you're saying because people are driving 2 hours, they're driving a long time, a ways away. They've never been to church, don't have any context, but then they come into service and they get saved and they get changed. And I think that that's something powerful that maybe we forget about sometimes because I think that we make, at least, sometimes I make caricatures in my head.
Yeah.
There's the people that love God and there's people that hate God.
Yeah.
And we forget about all of these people that have questions about God, that maybe have been hurt by church in the past, but they're still open to the idea of it. And I think that's one of my favorite things too, is like, you have so many people that, they're coming to church and I love when you can recognize somebody that's like never been to church before. Last service, last week, I had somebody come up because we do prayer at the front. At the end of service, he came up to me and he's like, hey, can you pray for me? And I was like, yeah, of course. And he goes, I'm sorry, I was too intimidated to come up and pray with the experts at the end of service. And I'm like, oh yeah, so you're not church, but I love that. And so as we're creating spaces, as you are creating spaces at Vintage for people to find the Lord, I think one of the difficulties that pastors face is a level of criticism, especially, in the areas that you're pastoring. And so how do you find yourself dealing with criticism that comes your way, justified, unjustified? Because I just think that when you're the lead pastor, right, you're the one that's preaching, and there's so many opinions that can come your way from people that people that you don't. And so I find that people have different temperaments for that. And I'm wondering what yours is with that.
Yeah, I've never been criticized, so I can't really.
Exactly.
No, but I've heard of people that have. No, I think and that stuff's real. And I think more people, more problems is, as our church has grown, it's doubled in the last 6 months, and it's very exciting. And then with it, there's a lot that comes with it. And I think what I have tried to do is, when I get home on a Sunday, on my drive home from church, I just say, God, did I do and say what you wanted me to do today? And if his answer is yes, then I got to go, okay, then I'm good. And as much as it depends upon me, live at peace with all people and all the things. But one, just to get that place where it's like, God, I want to please you above all. I am a recovering people pleaser. So that's hard for me because I do, as a pastor, I do care for people and I do care what people think, but I got to make sure that I'm, one, that I don't let that creep into my ability to lead and to do the things God's asked me to do. I think the criticism, some of it, we're in a day where it's like, in some ways, in a good way, you don't get away with anything these days. Like there's someone that's going to find out and someone's going to call it out and shout it out.
Start recording.
I mean, it's real. And so I think one is like, maybe, I don't know if this is what you're asking, but my motive more than ever is like, I want to finish well. And I remember when I was 24, and I'm throwing a big bomb here, but we've written about it in our book, and our kids all know our story, but we were in ministry and my wife had an affair year 3. And she had a background of sexual abuse, things that never got worked through. And like we always tell people, like, marriage doesn't fix what's broken. It just reveals it, when you get to that level of intimacy. And I've seen, what it's like to kind of your life explode and go through the whole rebuilding process. And I think what I've tried to really do is, we're all in process, but I do think as a leader, there is a level of health. There's a level of humility. There's a level of accountability that is required. And where in my 20s, I just wanted to be known. I wanted to do something big for God and be famous for it. I mean, gross. But I was building stuff, starting things, and so much of my fingerprints were on it. And there was like this mixed bag of selfish ambition, godly ambition. And so I think to now, it's like, one, I don't have any of my area of my life that is hidden. I want to walk everything in the light. And success looks very different to me. Is like, if my marriage is not healthy, if my kids don't want to be my friend, it doesn't matter how big this thing is. How many leaders have we seen fall because they were trying to take care of the house of God and they neglected their own? And I think it's a really, really dangerous thing.
Yeah, you said selfish ambition versus godly ambition. And I think at the end of the day, pride is one of those things. It's like, it's kind of like body odor, right? It's like everybody recognizes it except for you. And I'm wondering, how in your life, how have you discerned between the two? Because a lot of times, right, it's like, well, I want what God wants. And if I'm leading a big church, if I have a lot of influence, isn't that honoring God? And I think a lot of it can get convoluted. So how do you help discern that in your own life?
Yeah, I mean, I think you go, what is true humility? False humility is like that minimizing and deflecting and devaluing of ourselves. True humility is like, who am I in God? I know apart from him, I have nothing, but I know that in him, like an insecure Christian should be an oxymoron. So should a prideful Christian. Like those things should not exist. So like true humility is knowing who you are in God. And I remember when I was in my 20s going through a really difficult time, somebody gave me this book called Humility by Andrew Murray. And he was a South African pastor. And that book, it genuinely changed my life. It changed the trajectory of my life. And he defined humility as complete dependency upon God and everything. And then he defines pride as just the loss of humility. It's not that I can do it by myself. It's not necessarily I think I'm better than everybody. It's just like I can do it on my own. And I think it's dangerous in any setting. It's really dangerous in a ministry setting where, if we're trying to do things out of dependency upon God, but if you're gifted enough, you can do a lot of things on your own, and you can create fruit that looks real, but it's the fruit that doesn't remain. It's like that, these, when I was younger, that wax apples and banana, it looks so real, and you just pick it up, chip your tooth, and it's like, we are enamored by man-made fruit, and God wants nothing to do with it because that fruit doesn't remain. It's the fruit of intimacy that lasts. And so I think cultivating that, God, I look back in the arc of my story and I go, man, some of this was self-inflicted wounds, but even those, if we lean in, there's a gift on the other side of it.
Yeah.
Some of it is, in Peter, it talks about, don't be surprised by the fiery trials. It says the necessary fiery trials that prove the genuineness of your faith. And I just think, man, it's the danger we we live in today is somebody can have influence, but they have no authority.
Yeah.
And authority comes at a price. Authority means you got some scars on you, and that's what you've gone through, and it's what you've overcome. And then how do we lead? I know a guy that, well, I should be careful. Anyway, as a leader, like I have this big scar on my arm. If I showed it to you and I talked about the wound, but it was still bleeding and still had a Band-Aid, you go, bro, that probably needs to get healed up. You keep talking about the wound. But if I can go, oh yeah, I got cut here, but like it's healed up now. There's a scar here. The wound is where you've been healed, not where you were hurt. And a lot of people are leading from their wounding and not from where they've been healed from. And so I don't know. I think there's something in there that's like, all right, God, unless you build the house, those who build labor in vain. I think to your question, my deal is motive. And I just always go back and say, okay, I want to do this thing. Okay, why do I want, am I doing this for me? And God calls us to do great things. I mean, I've been reading through Joshua. I've just been living in Joshua. And he's like, listen, he's like, I'm going to exalt you. He's like, I'm gonna elevate you in the eyes of Israel. But then he goes, so that they know that I'm with you. Like it's not so that you're famous and have this huge following. He's like, they just need to know that I'm with you because I'm calling you to lead these people.
Yeah, and I love what you're talking about, because I think that this is I think it's a struggle in our world today, right? In social media era, Instagram, TikTok. I just think that we're seeing, and it's not a bad thing, but like, of course, as a church's Instagram or page, of course we want to show the best things, right? Of course we want to show the fruit and I'm not one to criticize that, but at the same time, I do think that maybe there are people in the world that they're following this pastor, right? Yeah. And they're like, pastoring is so sick. Like, this is the coolest thing ever. They're preaching on stage. They're on an airplane. They're traveling. Yeah, exactly. Like they got and again, I'm not faulting what the pastor's posting. I'm just saying sometimes it creates this image to people. And, we have interns at our church and they're always like, I want to plant a church. I want to lead a church. And my first thing to them is like, are you sure? This is not like something. I always say you got to make sure that God has called you to the ministry, because when I see people jump into ministry that aren't called to ministry, it almost exclusively ends with them bitter at the church and frustrated and hurt, because like you said earlier on the podcast, there's this whole like backdoor, like we're all human and we're still frustrated with one another and dealing with teamwork and all of that. And so how would you encourage somebody that says like, I want to plant a church. I want to lead a church. Like, what would be some wisdom for them?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think why you go, well, why do I want to do this? Is there a clear sense of calling that's been confirmed by others in gifting and people that are trusted around me, affirming this thing in me? And I think to the whole deal of, influence and whatnot, it's like, I think the way I would say it is we're all so valuable. We're just not that important. And I think if we start thinking we're important, or that we are God's greatest gift to God, or that he needs us, it's ridiculous. God loves me. He delights in me. He doesn't love me more because I'm a pastor. He's not more impressed by the size of our church. I'm not going to get to heaven. He's going to like, all right, church is 500 or more. You guys are over here. Yes. Smaller church. Like it's ridiculous, because we can read Revelation of like what actually matters, which is like first love stuff. If you lose your first love, it doesn't matter all the works, all the things. It doesn't matter. We're going to even account for those things. And so I think anybody I would talk to people that have actually done it. And I would say when it all fell apart when I was 24 and we were in ministry and we ended up 3 years to get out, to heal, to recovery, when it all came to light, and I was meeting with this pastor in my most vulnerable time, first time I'd ever shared with anybody about the affair. And this pastor went on to tell me how, there's a guy named Robert Clinton who studied Christian leadership. He was at Fuller Seminary, and he studied 1,300 leaders, 800 from the Bible, and then the other 500 just throughout history. Okay. And he was basically trying to just see how many of leaders actually finish well. And it was around like 20% or something. So around 80% for various reasons disqualify themselves, blow up their life, lose their faith along the way. And you're going, wow, okay, that seems kind of consistent with, when the stories you hear. And then he kind of was looking at who are those that finished well and what did they do? What were the distinctives? But one of the things he found was in God's timeline of their development was like from age 18 to 29. It wasn't about impact. It was about identity. So it was loss. It was disappointment. God was forming the inner life. 30 to 50 was like the ministry years that began to be born, but it was in proportion to what God had done in their 20s, then 50 to 70s convergence, and then 70 on is like legacy years. But I remember as a 24-year-old, this guy walking me through this, watching my whole life blow up. And that became the journey. Is like, okay, the 20s, it's not about what I'm doing, it's about who I'm becoming. And if we don't get that down, what happens is people get elevated because of gifting. They don't have character, and their gifting crushes them, right? That's what ends up happening with so many of these leaders, is they stop tending to their own soul. And it's in Psalm, I think it's 78, or Psalm 178, it says that, and David shepherded the people with skillful hands and an upright heart. The problem is we can lead with skillful hands, but if we don't have the heart of integrity, at some point those get out of order, and collapse, I think, is inevitable. And so I would just say, somebody that's considering it, is, what's your ambition? Like, I think the older I get and what I've been through, like, my ambition meter is very low at this point. It's not that I don't care. I want to honor God and I want to do things He's called me to do, but to build something, to have a big thing, I care less. I'm not saying it's still not in me, but I that's what I would say is one motive. I don't know that we're ever, quote, ready, but I do think a measure of like equipping and preparedness. And I understand, like, God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called, and don't let others look down on you because you're youth. But I'm just telling you, for young people, to take the time to go deep in your identity in Jesus. That has nothing to do with your gifting and your contribution, because that's the only thing that's going to give you longevity.
Man, that was, when you're talking about, when you're in the lowest moment, you're going through healing. And then I just honor the fact that how many people go through something like that, lowest moments, and it's different for different people, but then they just they never come back from it, and then kind of what we were talking about earlier is just like everything is jaded going forward. And even if they do, do some healing in their life, especially with church and with faith, it just kind of gets twisted. And I'm just curious. So you get your healing, you move here, you're saying like, I'm never going to be a pastor again. So once those people start prophesying over you, once you get that phone call from your buddy, is your knee-jerk reaction like, absolutely not, you're hearing wrong? Or is your knee-jerk reaction like, okay, let's do this, let's investigate it? Because I'm sure that's, and we have mindsets and we have ideas of what the future is going to be, but it's like when the Lord invades those and interrupts those, I'm curious how that was for you.
Man, I think if anything, I just want to do what He's called me to do. And I think over the years, I've learned to discern His voice, not perfectly. And there's many times where I don't feel like I hear anything, but I feel like in this whole journey where He's led us here, I think I've learned His voice enough to know when it's like His leading and prompting. So I wasn't even fighting it. I mean, I remember telling our church before we moved to LA, I used to always say like, if God invites you into something, say yes before you know how. And that's like a great little tweet, but it's like when you find yourself living it. And so I think once I knew it was Him, I had a lot of questions, but I wasn't resisting, because it's like, God, if that's what you're doing, like I kind of prayed for this. It looks different than I thought, but I did kind of ask for an answer, and you brought it, and it looks different. But man, I can look back now these last 4 years, and genuinely the last 4 years have been the best 4 years of my life.
Wow.
They've been the best 4 years. It has been so healing for my family. All my kids love Jesus wholeheartedly. They're our best friends. We're doing life together. They're all uniquely gifted. One's a tattoo artist. The other plays college football. The other's an actor. The other's a singer. And I look at the uniqueness of my kids, and all of that is the fruit of like what we've been through. And they love Jesus in a very authentic way. And they love the church. They sit on the front row with me. They pray over me before service. They hug me after I preach. Like, I'm not boosting I'm just saying it's real and it's authentic. Yes. But I think that's because of what we've been through.
Wow.
And I think they've seen God in an authentic way,
I love I believe it's in Isaiah, when he's prophesying and he says that God will create watered gardens in scorched places. And
right.
How often do we want God to remove us from the scorched places so that we can have a watered garden? Right. But it's oftentimes in the scorched places that God actually creates a watered garden, which is what I respect so much about your story. And the fact that the church is where it's at and your family is where it's at is incredible. And so, I'm curious because you mentioned you and your wife wrote a book. And so maybe just, for a couple of minutes, kind of talk about the premise of that, because I think that as we're talking about all these different stories, I mean, that's a key part of your guys' testimony. And I'm curious about it too, because again, I'm such a pro-church person and I'm such a pro-family person. And I just hate when those things aren't aligned, which is a lot of the world, unfortunately.
Totally. Which, imagine how God feels, like how grieved he is over that. I think, so when we were moved out here, the kind of doing the work in media and whatnot, and I had started a production company called Welcome Home. And I remember moving 20 times going, God, my company's called Welcome Home and I don't have a home. Like, this is cruel. Like, and I remember in my spirit feeling like God said, because home is not where you live, it's who you live life with. And so then we go on the journey, moving and all that stuff, and start experiencing it in real time. And so then we had made a trailer for a docuseries we were trying to create called Finding Family. And we had great representation, nearly got picked up by a couple large networks. And that trailer ended up getting sent to a book publisher in Nashville, who reached out to us and asked us to write this book and sign. So we signed this book deal. So Jules is going through cancer the second time. I mean, our lives, it's just almost comical. We're writing this book and we're going, my goodness, we are still in the middle of this story. Like, there's no end to this story that we're writing. And the whole essence of the book was the journey of what we've been through in 20 plus years of life, the journey of these last few years moving to LA, and ultimately going, family is the only way we make it. And because of people have so much trauma and pain around family, or something that was meant to be family. Like I said, it could have been church, could have been the family of origin, but almost looking how God has, there's a couple of scriptures where it would look like Jesus is elevating spiritual family over natural family. When they bring his mother and brother, he's like, my mother and brother are those who do my will. He says, anybody who hates their father, who doesn't hate their father and mother can't follow me. And, he wasn't saying to literally hate them, but he's saying anybody who prefers them over me can't follow me. And so you're going, okay, God has a high standard and invitation for this thing called family. So we're writing the book, Fighting for Family, and the tagline is the relentless pursuit of building belonging. While we're doing research on the book, writing it literally, like I said, around the corner, which is crazy, it's COVID. And the U.S. Surgeon General puts out this 85-page document. It was titled Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation. Wow. And it was kind of proving the point of we're the most connected generation because of technology, and it's the loneliest generation that's ever lived. Sociologists say we're the most divided our nation's been since the Civil War. And you think about the political divides, but then you see how that has worked its way into the church. Yep. And all the things. So if Jesus is John 17 about unity and the church can't even get along, then how would we expect the world to want to be a part of the thing we're saying is the best thing in the world to be a part of? And so as we wrote the book, the whole essence was, man, we're going to share openly and honestly about our struggles, but from a place of health, not a place of wounding. And help people identify the barriers in their life that keep them from experiencing the power of family. So each chapter is really kind of hitting on some of those core values, which is honor and forgiveness, and I can't even remember them all now, but the vulnerability, the authenticity, inviting people into your story, bringing belonging, not waiting for somebody to create it for you, invite people into it, knowing identity. It was all those things. So it was a whole journey to write it, but I look back, I'm like, God, you allowed us to go through a lot of this stuff just so that we could help other people ultimately.
That's awesome. Yeah. And what's it called?
Fighting for Family.
Fighting for Family. That's amazing. Okay. Last thought. That I'm curious, I think that this podcast, Foundations podcast, is just meant to tell stories and real stories of pastors, because the world has grown such a cynical view of leadership sometimes, of pastors. And so if somebody's, happens to listen to this podcast and they're wrestling with a level of church hurt, or wrestling with a level of cynicism towards pastors based off of experience or things that they've heard, just as maybe what's one encouragement to them as a pastor? I know sometimes when you're getting encouragement about pastoring from a pastor, it has limited, but just if you were to open up your heart and humbly just, express one thing to them, what would you say?
That's such a good question. I mean, first, just to, Jesus didn't wound you, and to separate that is like, he is perfect and we are imperfect representations of him. And I think the biggest thing is just to get to a place of forgiveness. And again, I can understand why people are apprehensive if you've had church wounding. And I'm not ever insinuating somebody should stay in a place that's abusive or unhealthy. But I would say if you're looking for a perfect church, they don't exist. I always tell people, if you find one, let me know and I'll go there. Like, it would be amazing. But I would say, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus and work through forgiveness, because bitterness is the thing that will keep you from your destiny more than anything else.
Yeah. Have you ever dealt with that yourself in the confines of church leadership?
Totally. I mean, 2018, before we moved here, we went through 4 months of the most painful thing with the church we'd started, and I mean, felt so hurt and misunderstanding, and I felt blindsided. And we went through 4 months of, I mean, it was devastating, bro. And yet God would consistently, as much as I felt angry and hurt by some leaders and misunderstood and dishonored and God kept saying, there's something I'm trying to do in you through this. So even if it's imperfect through the hands of man, God was in it. And here's what I found. I said this to somebody recently. If you view the discipline of the Lord as the punishment of man, you will miss the opportunity you have to grow. Wow. Because what sometimes people can't do is we want to blame man. And it's, again, not to excuse the imperfections of humans, but to also go, but God, is there something you're trying to do in me through this imperfect situation? And I look back, and God brought me to the end of this 4 months with our leaders. The way we broke through and got to full reconciliation, and all these people, I have friendship with every one of them. And there was a time where I was like, I don't even know how this would ever be possible. Wow. It was because God showed something in me about pride that I couldn't see and didn't know was there. And when he identified it, as much as it didn't justify what they had done, and I repented of it, everything turned. And so I think if we blame people, we're going to miss out on the opportunity God has for us.
That's so good. Well, thanks for the conversation, man.
Thank you, bro.
Incredible, humble heart. Vintage Church is blessed to have you, and Malibu in the area is blessed to have you. So we just appreciate you coming on to the podcast. Appreciate you having the conversation, and hope that the next years are going to be fruitful and full of favor for you guys.
Thank you, buddy. Appreciate you, man.